We're going to be considering this theme, Ambassadors for Christ. And tonight we're going to kick off by looking at servants of Jesus Christ. And the subline or the theme for our talk tonight is, who then is a faithful and wise servant? And it's taken from Matthew 24 and 25. And we're going to be spending quite a bit of time in those chapters tonight. But this is what we're going to cover off tonight. This is the approach we're going to take. We're going to look at servants of Jesus Christ by covering four things. Firstly, I want to talk about aspiration and how being a servant of Jesus Christ is a role that we should really strive for. Like it's something that we should aspire for. And that's actually quite counterintuitive. It's not immediately apparent to us that that's the kind of thing we should aim for. You're never going to get told that in a career class either. We're going to talk about choices and see how you have to make a choice because you already are serving someone. Then we'll focus on reality of what a servant actually does. Like, what does a servant of Jesus Christ look like? And how would you explain it to someone if they asked you? And we're going to hear from Jesus himself to answer that question. And finally, in the most of the class, we're going to spend focusing on this idea of watching. Like, what does it look like? What does it actually mean? So let's kick straight off by talking about aspiration. And I think there's a hard question that we have to ask and also a paradox. And it's these two things here. Why should you want to be a servant? Like, frankly, why is that something that at your stage of life you should aim to try and be this particular role? And secondly, the difficult paradox we have to address is, even if you want to be a servant, how can you serve someone that you can't see? How can you serve a master who's out of reach, who's completely invisible? Now, helpfully, Jesus precisely defines what serving him looks like, so we can answer that paradox. But the first one is a little harder. Why should you want to be a servant? And I think really to answer that, we have to totally change our mindset. It's what you call a paradigm shift, where you completely change the way you understand something. And the reason that's important is because in our society, and in every single society before ours, being a servant was not an aspirational role. People strive to escape servitude, not to embrace it. That's the story of the 19th and 20th century. The abolishment of slavery, the emancipation of repressed groups of people, the opportunity for social liberty, equality, fraternity, the pursuit of independence. These are the things that our society has spent 200 years striving to achieve, climbing up the corporate or the social ladder. So it's 2020. Why would I want to be a servant? Why send myself socially backwards in history? Those kind of questions and issues arise fundamentally because people do not understand what being a servant can actually mean. Or more specifically, they don't understand what being a servant of Jesus Christ means. And in fact, I think it goes even deeper than that, because people don't understand that they already are a servant. And the Bible is unmistakably clear on that. And we're going to now move into our second part of tonight, where we talk about choices. The truth is that everybody serves somebody, and that is what you call an objective truth. Now, I want to talk for a moment about what that means, because the idea of truth is discussed obviously at length in the Bible, and it's a really interesting one, particularly in our time today. If you're not familiar with the phrase, an objective truth is something that is true even if you don't believe it. It's a truth that is independent from subjectivity. It doesn't matter if you don't believe it. It doesn't matter if you refuse it. It still remains true. Now, a really simple example of this of an objective truth is that the planet we know as Earth is a sphere. Now, some people strenuously deny that, and they provide all sorts of evidence to show that actually, no, the Earth is flat. But the Earth doesn't care. It goes on being a sphere whether you believe it or not. Now, that's different from a personal truth, which is something that you hold to be true, but others do not. And you may have difficulty convincing others that it's true, no matter how much you're sure of it yourself. Now, for obvious reasons, religion is often put into that category. And finally, there's political truth, which can probably be best described as something that is said so often, it is held to be true by large groups of people, even if it is not. And sadly, there's probably lots of examples of that today. And we're at a point in our society where the phrase post-truth politics has been coined, and that's where things like alternative facts come from. So truth can be a pretty murky place to try and explore and understand in the current day. But for now, let's ignore the latter two and let's loop back to this objective truth that we're all servants. Whether you subscribe to a religious belief or not doesn't matter. In your lifetime, you will be serving someone. Now, the Bible helps elucidate this, and we're going to look up 2 quotes. In fact, we're going to look up quite a few quotes tonight, and because I can't hear the paper rustling on the screen, and I can't see how quick you are to turn the pages up, I've put all the quotes up on the screen, but I really encourage you, as long as I'm not doing my usual thing and going too fast, I encourage you to turn them up and look them up for yourself. And you'll notice most, in fact, all of the quotes on the screen should be from the ESV. So the first quote that I want to look up is John 8, verse 31 to 36. Jesus is having a dispute with the Jews, and he said to the Jews who believed on him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And that they get pretty indignant about this. They answer him, "We're offspring of Abraham. We've never been enslaved to anyone. How is it you say you'll become free?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed." So Jesus is pretty unequivocal that you're going to be a slave to something. It's going to either be a sin or not. Now, the Apostle Paul picks up on this idea and he expands it. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so just maybe check that you're on mute if possible. Now, the second quote I want to look up is this one on the screen, the Apostle Paul. It's an absolute classic from Romans chapter 6. And it's worth reading these verses. These are from verse 16 to 22, because this just makes it abundantly clear. "Don't you know, if you present yourself to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that you were once slaves of sin. You have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you are committed. And having been set free from sin, you've become slaves of righteousness. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness." In other words, when you're serving sin, you had no responsibility. You don't answer to anybody. You can do whatever you want. But what fruit were you getting at the time of those things of which you're now ashamed? The end of those things is death. But now you've been set free from sin and have become slaves of God. The fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end, eternal life. Now, the reason that's such a powerful quote is it clearly shows us there are just 2 choices. You can serve one of 2 masters, either sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness. Now, the choice is that stark, and so is the end game. Don't think you can serve both. That's pretty clear from this passage, right? One master rewards you with death, and the other one rewards you with life. It is physically impossible to get both rewards, which means it's physically impossible to serve both masters. Now, Jesus tells us this himself. In Matthew 6, a quote we know very well, "No man can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Now, that idea really resonated with Paul because he brings it up several times in his letters. And he talks about the inherent struggle of having this mind that just desperately wants to serve Jesus Christ, but a body that is stuck serving sin.
I'm a better Christian than you, Jesse. Haha.
I've just got an excerpt there on the screen, but the full quote from Romans 7, verse 22 says, "I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh, the law of sin." So there's this intense struggle going on where he recognizes his body defaults to serving sin, but he wants to serve God with his mind. And the way he comes up with to combat this struggle is to remember what Jesus Christ has done for us to allow us to escape servitude to sin. And Paul brings this up in Corinthians, and he says, you're bought with a price, so don't become servants of men. So all of these passages clearly demonstrate the stark choice that's in front of us. Now, I've taken all these passages from the Bible, and so people could say, well, that's a religious belief. It's a personal truth. You can have your two masters idea, but you can't make me believe it. The problem is, this is an objective truth. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not, it's still true. And you know why? What's the proof of it?
Rubbish.
Everybody dies. Death is the proof, right? Everybody dies. That's the bluntness of the choice we have. So welcome to the new paradigm. You already are a servant. Forget about all the escape from servitude, the emancipation, the striving for social liberty, equality, fraternity. In 200 years, all we've done is help people escape servitude to each other. But that doesn't change the fact that we're still all servants. So the choice that we're left with is, which master do we wish to serve? Now, for the purpose of tonight, and given the fact that you've logged onto the call, I'm hopeful that you've either made this choice or you're in the process of making this choice. And so we can turn our attention to the two most important parts of tonight, which is, firstly, what is the reality of being a servant? Not of sin, but of righteousness. And this is where we can really hear from a lot from the words of Jesus himself, because he makes it unmistakably clear what a servant of Jesus Christ looks like. So let's come back to Matthew 24 and 25, because there's a lot of passages that I want to pull out of here. Again, if you can mute, that'd be great, because I'm getting feedback. So that'd be really helpful. So just check if you're on mute or not, so we don't have any awkward interruptions of you snoring and stuff. I was doing a Bible class on Wednesday night for Punch Bowl, and while I was talking, my screen just went completely blank and the call cut out. And it turned out that my laptop had gone to sleep, which is a huge hit to your confidence. When you're speaking to an inanimate object and it goes to sleep, you're kind of like, what on earth is the ecclesia doing right now? So yeah, keep the mute on so I don't hear you snoring. So we read an intro reading from Matthew 24. Thanks, Johnny, for that. And it was all about servants and watching and not knowing when the hour was coming, so needing to stay alert. And in verse 45 of Matthew 24 was that great passage where we took our theme from. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord has made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find doing. Now, come over to the next chapter, because we're going to read a section of Matthew 25, verse 31 to 46. Now, it is a slightly longer section. I need to push my computer back so I can actually get to my Bible. It is a slightly longer section, but it's really, really important for our class tonight. So I'm going to be reading this from the ESV, and I don't have it on the screen. Sorry, I'll read it from the ESV. So please turn it up. Matthew 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he'll separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it unto one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me. Then he'll say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Because I was hungry, and you didn't give me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you didn't clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. Then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you, any of those things, hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then he will say to them, truly I say to you, as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Now, the lesson from that parable is pretty self-evident. But there's an interesting phrase in there, the least of these my brothers. Why is that interesting? Because it could potentially imply there's some kind of servant hierarchy. Because if there's some brothers who are least, maybe there's some brothers and sisters who are greater. No, that is clearly not the case, and that is clearly not the teaching of the Bible. So there's quite a bit that Jesus says about this, and we're just going to pull out a couple of exchanges. This occurs in both Matthew and Mark's Gospel, but we'll just use Mark's Gospel. In Mark 9, verse 35, what's happened here? Sorry, I just lost my screen. Mark 9, verse 35, he sat down and called the 12, and he said unto them, if anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all. And actually, if you can, turn over, because Matthew 10 is just this fantastic quote in the context of being a servant. Because in Matthew chapter 10, and sorry to state the obvious, but this happens right after Matthew 9. So he's only just told them about the idea of being the chiefest of all actually means being a servant to everybody. And yet in the very next chapter, they are disputing about who's going to occupy these elevated positions next to Jesus in the life to come. And this is what happens. In verse 42, Jesus called them to him and said, you know, those who are rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So, in summary, serving Jesus Christ, an invisible master, is achieved by serving and ministering to each other. So, to break down that section in Matthew 25 that we read, serving Jesus means giving food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, visiting the imprisoned. This is how servants of Jesus Christ behave. This is their role. Now ask yourself an honest question, and you need to employ a bit of your imagination here. If you're in a situation where you are facing certain death, like no way out, like the Grim Reaper is face to face with you, there's no escape, and then someone offers you a way out. You are millimeters from death and someone offers you a way out, but you have to do something for them. At this precise moment in time, you don't even care about seeing the contract. You're happy to sign up as long as you can escape death. Like, it doesn't matter if I have to sacrifice a goat every Friday afternoon and eat its heart. I'll do it if I don't have to die. You're willing to sign up to anything. So you take the deal, you accept the escape from death, and then you see the conditions of what you've got to do in return. And this is what the person demands. Feed the hungry and thirsty. Give them your own food and drink if that's what it takes. Make sure you know who is hungry and thirsty so you can tend to their needs. Welcome the stranger. Make them feel at home in your ecclesia, in your house, in your family. Practice hospitality. Open your home, open your heart. Clothe the naked. Care for those who don't have enough for the basics of daily life. Be keen to their needs. Don't withhold what you have. Don't turn away from their nakedness or find reasons to blame them for it. Share, knowing that everything you have actually belongs to God. Provide for those who are less fortunate than yourself. Visit the sick. Find out who they are. Ask how they're going. Don't just pray for God's arms to be around them. Go there and put your own arms actually around them. Visit the imprisoned. Enter into their captivity. Sit down beside them, whether they're there of their own doing or not. Edify and encourage them, no matter how bad their imprisonment and their situation is. And you're like, those are the demands. That's it. That's what I have to do to escape death. Like no money, no sacrifice, no great heroic feat, no painful thing that I have to give up. Like I've just got to look after people. I have to serve people. I've got to be a good person. And the answer is yes. That's the demands. Jesus himself says this. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And as another one of his faithful servant observes, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome, they're not heavy. Like this is what serving our absent master looks like. He might be invisible, he might be out of reach, but our fellow servants are right next to us and they need us, whether it's food or water, and whether that's natural or spiritual, you can tell, whether it's clothing or whether it's being visited when they're sick or visiting them when they're stuck in captivity, whatever it is that's enslaved them. They're right there around us, all around us. And Jesus says, when you do it to them, it's like you did it to me. And I'm over here borrowing Brother Steve and Sister Kezia Wilson Cross Internet. And I kind of mentioned this in passing to Steve. And he said, it's like when Jesus appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus. He said, why are you persecuting my servants? No, he didn't. He said, why are you persecuting me? So when we serve the servants of Jesus Christ, it's like we're serving him ourselves. And if we persecute the servants, it's like we're persecuting him. So that's how we escape servitude to sin. And that's how we escape death that awaits all the servants of sin. I was talking to Stace about it earlier tonight. It's a little bit like Naaman. Like Naaman wanted to be freed from leprosy. Basically, he wanted freedom from the death sentence that he could literally see in his body. And he expected some great feat. And he was told to go wash in the river. Like he was given this totally easy, totally normal thing to do that any normal person with a basic sense of hygiene would hopefully be doing anyway. And he was like, that's not good enough. And it took basically his servants to convince him that, well, he didn't ask you to climb a mountain. He didn't ask you to catch a javelin flying at your chest. Like he asked you to bathe in the river. Why don't you give it a shot? And that's what's so beautiful about the commandments of Jesus. They are not burdensome and they free us from certain death. So that's the reality of serving Jesus Christ. But there's one more thing that Jesus requires of the servants, and it's this idea that I want to explore for the rest of tonight. And it's this idea of watching, and it came out very clearly in Matthew 24. So please turn back to Matthew 24 and 25, because this is where we really see the strong idea about watching coming out. Now, Matthew 24, verse 42, he says, watch therefore, for you know not hour when your Lord does come. So the question is, what does watching involve? What exactly are we supposed to be watching? Now, I've divided this into three aspects based on my study of where and when this idea appears in the New Testament. So here they are in no particular order. First thing I think we're supposed to watch, and we get this from Matthew 24 and 25, is we are supposed to watch the fulfillment of prophecy. Now, this can be sometimes, often, a contentious topic. And like anything, there's positions of extremes. And these are not straw men. These are real things that I've heard and seen said. On one side, there's people who may suggest that prophecy is not so important today. It's too difficult to understand, or we can't be certain, or there's too many conflicting interpretations, or it's really only meant for the people of the day, not for us. I've really heard those things. On the other side, there's people who possibly take it too far. Every single big news event is somehow related to Bible prophecy. And here's a very specific date and a very specific way in which this prophecy will be fulfilled. And this is what we'll definitely see in the future because of my interpretation of this prophecy. We should not allow those two extremes to push into the shade the importance of Bible prophecy for people who are aspiring and striving to be servants of Jesus Christ. Now, that's not just my opinion. That is, I believe, the teaching of the Bible. So let's look at a couple of examples. So keeping with the context of our title tonight, who then is a faithful and wise servant, taken from Matthew 24, let's look at what this teaches us about watching. Now, the people watching the Olivet prophecy, the people actually listening to the Olivet prophecy in the time of Matthew 24, they were told to watch out for something. And if you look at Matthew 24, verse 15, which is up on the screen, hopefully, you can see what I'm jumping ahead here. Hold on. Yes, I've got carried away here. Right. We'll pause that thought for a second. Come across to Mark 13 because I can't bodge the slides. Mark 13 is basically a parallel record, if you like, of the Olivet prophecy, and here we really clearly see this idea of watching coming out. Okay, so let's just quickly look at this point that I'm going to bring up here. So in Mark 13, I've got all these quotes on the screen, and it's maybe even worth grabbing a colouring in pencil or just a pencil to quickly circle, because you can see this idea of watching keeps coming out. So in verse 13, when you see the abomination of desolation coming, and we'll talk about that in a second, when you see this thing happening, then do something about it. And then again, in verse 26, then they shall see the Son of Man coming. Verse 29, so in like manner, when you see these things come to pass. Verse 33, take heed, watch and pray. Verse 34, the Son of Man is like someone who went on a far journey, and he told the porter to watch. Verse 35, watch therefore, because you don't know when the master's coming. And then verse 37, what I say to you now, I say to you all, watch. So that's a pretty clear idea about just from how many times is that? 7 occurrences in this one chapter about looking for and seeing and watching for the fulfillment of something that has been spoken of. Now, sorry about the slight interruption, but come back hopefully to Matthew 24, and I've now got the correct slide coming up, because in Matthew 24, which is exactly the same story as Mark 13, in verse 15, Jesus tells them what it is they're supposed to see. What is it they're looking for? When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, brackets, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let the one who's in the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And the person who's in the field, don't go back and get your cloak. Get out of there. That's what they're supposed to see. They're looking for the abomination of desolation. And that may not be super clear what that actually, what does that mean? Apart from a fantastic use of the English language, what does that mean? And the obvious answer should be, we need to go back to Daniel's prophecy and look it up and read it carefully and discover that. And that would be a lot of fun, and it is a whole class of its own and outside our remit tonight. So instead, let's look at the companion chapter, Luke 21, because this is what Luke 21 says. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. If you're inside the city, get out. And if you're out in the country, don't enter into the city. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. That's pretty unequivocal. Jesus speaks about an event that is going to take place in the future. He doesn't describe it in precise detail. He doesn't say who the army is going to be, or what color their tunic is, or which direction they'll come from, or even what time of day they're going to appear. It's just a very broad description of a clearly noticeable event. In other words, this is a Bible prophecy, and it's on the Mount of Olives, which is why we call it the Olivet prophecy. These listeners, these servants, these people he's telling, you've got to watch and be like a servant. These people needed to watch for this event to happen. And when it happened, they had to take action. There was no sitting around on the housetop arguing about its interpretation or its relevance. They needed to recognize the sign, and they needed to act according to the instructions given. And as we said, Mark's gospel in chapter 13, I think that brings it out even more powerfully. And it is worth going through and colouring those references to see or to watch where you can. But another writer who highlights the importance of prophecy is Peter in his second letter. He says, we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you will do well to pay attention, as to a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your heart. And the risen Jesus, through the pen of the Apostle John on Patmos, highlights this point again in Revelation. In Revelation 1 verse 3, which again is a prophecy, it's written about things which shall shortly come to pass. He says, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the word of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written, for the time is near." And then right at the end of the book is this great little quote here, Revelation 19 verse 10. "I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." So the first aspect of watching as a servant is looking for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. But one more thought on this. While we're highlighting the importance of watching in the context of prophecy, how about a gentle warning? And take it from someone who's made this very mistake. Keeping a keen eye on the fulfillment of prophecy, I don't think means making predictions about the future. It's easy to get excited, as I have done, and make statements like, "Expect to see this happen," or "Watch for this event to occur." Now, in order to control my enthusiasm, I have a big quote written in big, messy, bold letters across the top of Ezekiel 38 to remind me of this. It's a quote attributed to Cyril Tennant, and this is what it says. "The purpose of Bible prophecy is that we shall be able to recognize the signs when they appear, not that we shall be able to predict the future." And I've also got 3 Bible quotes that help reinforce this maxim. And helpfully, they're all the words of Jesus. And I don't have these on the screen because I want us all to turn them up. So the first one is John chapter 2. So turn over to John chapter 2 and we'll see what Jesus says on this matter. I'm going to read from the ESV again. "So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' And Jesus answered, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said," so that's a prophecy, isn't it? "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple. How will you raise it in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. And here's the key part. "When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." So at that moment, Jesus gave a prophecy, and the purpose of it was that when the disciples saw that event happen, they remembered his words and they believed. Remember that quote from Revelation 19, verse 10. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Well, what's the next quote? John chapter 12. Let's look at John 12, verse 14 to 16. This one says, "And Jesus, when Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written in a prophecy. 'Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt.' His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and had been done to him." And the best one is saved till last, which is John 14, verse 27 to 29. So let's read these words. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let them be afraid. You heard me say to you, I'm going away, and I will come to you." So there's another prophecy. "If you had loved me, you would have rejoiced, because I'm going to the Father, for the Father is greater than I." And here's the clincher. "And now I have told you before it takes place, so that when it does take place, you may believe." So that I think is the key about watching for prophecy. It's not trying to make predictions of the future to prove ourselves correct. Jesus says the fulfillment of Bible prophecy is recognizing the signs when they appear and believing as a result of it and doing something about it. So that's watching prophecy. But watching is not just confined to prophecy. There's a second and more personal thing than that. Now let's have another look at this. And again, we'll stick with our context of the Olivet prophecy. This quote is from Luke 21. I think it's pretty clear just looking at the screen. "But watch yourselves, Jesus says, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. What does that mean? What is dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life? I'll tell you what it is. It's serving sin. Remember that quote we read right at the start of the class when Paul said in Romans 6, when you were serving sin, you were free from responsibility. You could do whatever you want until that master comes knocking with the reward, and then there's no escape. And Jesus says, you've got to watch yourself. You've got to watch to make sure that you don't turn back to King sin, that you don't get weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. Otherwise, the day will come on you suddenly, because it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. Now, there's actually lots of verses we could look up, but I just wanted to put that one up there because it's the best for me. Watch yourself and keep a close eye on your own behavior as we see the day approaching. That's got to be a key verse that we should constantly remind ourselves about every time we see Jesus telling us to watch. I think we're making a mistake if we think watching just means keeping tabs on CNN or prophecynews.com. And finally, the third thing we need to watch is, of course, our own brothers and sisters. Watching our own behavior is critical in the lead up to Jesus Christ, especially when you think the whole point of this talk is understanding how we can serve Jesus Christ and serve each other. But it can't end with us, otherwise it would be incredibly insular. Now, we've already looked at what it looks like to serve an absent master, but here's some further evidence about watching out for each other. Here's 3 quotes. 1 Corinthians 16, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, be strong, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. And I urge you, brothers, you know the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. So Paul in Corinthians says, watching means doing things in love and devoting yourself to the service of the saints and looking out for your fellow worker and laborer. Well, here's another one, again from Paul in Hebrews 13, verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Why? Because they are watching over you. They are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. And one last one, the best saved till last. 1 Peter 4, verse 8 to 10. The end of all things is at hand. And he could literally be writing these words to you and I. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and watch unto prayer. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, because love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as God's stewards, as good stewards of God's varied grace. Like, what an amazing quote, which just, for me, sums up everything that we've been talking about tonight. That is what a servant of Jesus Christ does when they're watching. They watch unto prayer, they love each other earnestly, they show hospitality, and they do things without grumbling. And when they've received something, they use that gift, whatever it is, whether it's a material gift or a social gift or a spiritual gift, they use that to serve each other so that they can be counted a good steward of God's grace. Like that quote in 1 Peter, to me, if you don't remember anything else for tonight, I want you to remember that, because that is what a servant of Jesus Christ does when they're watching. So that brings our study to a close this evening. So let's briefly recap what we've covered. Firstly, aspiration. Being a servant of Jesus Christ is something we can and should aspire towards. But it really does take a change of mindset, because being a servant in our society is not something that you should aspire for. And we've got to turn away from this idea that servitude is slavery. And instead, we've got to understand our choices, because we saw pretty starkly at the beginning of the class that we already are a servant. It's up to us whether we choose to serve sin or serve Jesus Christ. And don't kid yourself. It is a binary outcome, 0 or 1, death or life. It is physically impossible to receive both rewards, which means it is physically impossible to properly serve both masters. We looked at the reality of what serving Jesus Christ means. At its most fundamental, because he is an absent master, it means serving each other, caring for the needy, supporting the sick, visiting the imprisoned, clothing the naked. Whenever we do those things, it's like we're doing it to Jesus Christ himself. And I just want you to remember that analogy of staring death in the face and being willing to do anything to escape it, and then being given this list of things you have to do. And it basically amounts to things that would hopefully do anyway to each other, looking out for each other and caring for one another. And finally, and I think most importantly, we've looked at what watching actually means according to the words of Jesus himself. Servants need to watch. Jesus requires it of us, and we saw that in the reading Johnny did in Matthew 24. Partly this means watching the fulfillment of prophecy, and we saw quotes that reminded us of the importance of that. But it's just as much about watching our own behavior, and especially watching out for the needs of our brothers and sisters. So that's what we've covered tonight. And I think it's fitting that the very last chapter of the Bible talks about our final destiny if we do aspire and strive to be a servant of Jesus Christ. Because in Revelation 22, it says, "No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads." Now, that has to be something that all of us can truly aspire towards. I hope that's encouraging. I hope you really want to make that choice to be a servant of Jesus Christ. And thanks very much for listening in tonight.